Okay, hello A-Pushers, Mr. Ristau here. We are going to go through the content notes for Chapter 24. Chapter 24 covers World War II, and I've mentioned many times, like any other war, make sure that you're paying attention to causes and effects of World War II, and hopefully those will come here nice and clear for you during the slides as we go through these notes. Recall that we wrapped up the Great Depression and the New Deal prior to spring break, so here we go with Chapter 24. Here is our preview checklist to make sure that as you're reading through Chapter 24 and you're listening to the lecture here, these are some of the things that I pulled out of the reading. Appeasement, the Munich Conference, make sure you're familiar with the definition of appeasement and what the significance was of the Munich Conference. The debate that came about as a result of World War II, whether to stay out of it, you were an isolationist, or you were an interventionist, which means you favored entering World War II. The Atlantic Charter, the famous document that was signed between President Roosevelt, FDR is still in office, remember, and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. We'll take a look at how minorities and women were affected by World War II, their opportunities for employment, and etc. The Double V campaign and the Zoot Suit riots all have to do with minorities and how they're affected here at home by the war. And also the Japanese-American internment camps. Japanese-American citizens were sent to internment camps shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And then, of course, World War II ending when the United States decided to drop not one but two atomic bombs, ushering in the atomic age and the nuclear age, and it would set the course for the United States to be a global superpower. Now, World War II, the years which you're looking at here, St. Peter's Cathedral in London. World War II officially, the years 1939 to 1945. Keep in mind, though, that the United States does not enter the war until 1941, until after the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Okay, so U.S. involvement in World War II is 1941 to 1945. All right. We jump back a little bit in time. We take a look at FDR's foreign policy. This is primarily through the 1930s. Once he comes into office in 1932, he opens up a formal recognition of the Soviet Union, which essentially means that we are now sending an ambassador to the Soviet Union, and we officially recognize the Soviet Union as a legitimate country. Talking about possible trade options with the Soviets, and we're becoming increasingly more worried about the powerful power of Germany and the Nazi Party, because by 1932, 3, and 4, the Nazis and Hitler are already in power. President Roosevelt attempts to improve relations with Latin America. If you think back of our relationship with the Caribbean countries, it hasn't been good throughout our history. This goes all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Spanish-American War up through the early 1900s. Roosevelt attempts to improve that relationship with Latin America by creating the Good Neighbor policy. And he denounces U.S. armed intervention moving forward in this part of the world. In fact, he sets up a trade agreement with other countries, including Latin American countries, that he hopes would be reciprocal in nature. And what the Congress and President decided to do was to reduce the U.S. tariffs on these goods coming from other countries if they would reduce their tariffs on U.S. goods entering their countries. In Europe, we see the rise of totalitarianism and fascism and dictatorships, the first of which would be Benito Mussolini. That's who you're looking at here. He would become the fascist totalitarian dictator of Italy in 1922. Also coming to power during this time, two others that I'm sure you heard of. Joseph Stalin on the right becomes the totalitarian dictator of the Soviet Union in 1926. And then 1933, the man at the bottom, of course, is Adolf Hitler. He would become the Nazi Party leader, popularly elected, I might add, to office in 1933. The German citizens voted him in and the Nazi Party into office. We also see a dictator taking charge in Japan. His name is Hideki Tojo. Japan still does have the emperor at this time in the 1930s and 40s, but really the day-to-day operations of the government are essentially run by Hideki Tojo. So Japan, in essence, is run by a militaristic style government, by a board of generals, essentially, and at the head of that government is Hideki Tojo. So these countries start to militarize heavily. They start to rebuild their countries after World War between the wars, the 20s and 30s, promising their citizens that they can bring their countries back to power, back to glory. And one of the ways they do that is they start to rearm, and especially in Italy and Germany and Japan. And they seek to expand their borders. They seek other territories. They seek countries. They seek regions, land that they believe is rightfully theirs that was taken away from them at the end of World War I. Japan, for example, would invade Manchuria next door, which is an area just north of China. Japan is an island country, of course, so they're seeking out raw materials and other natural resources. And to do that, they need to expand their territory and invade countries and regions, and Manchuria was rich in natural resources. This would threaten the open door policy that the United States established with China back in the late 19-teens and 1920s. Japan would withdraw from the League of Nations as a sign of aggression, and they would also begin to build up their navy. Italy would also show aggression by attacking Ethiopia in 1935. So you have these countries here in Europe that are very militaristic. They're starting to rebuild their militaries. They're starting to rearm, and they're starting to spread their influence and power outward, seeking new countries and new territories to invade and take over. Here in the United States, in 1934, a congressional committee was formed. It was known as the Nye Commission. It was not headed by Bill Nye, the science guy, but rather the senator. And if you recall, coming out of World War I, many Americans were disillusioned with American participation in World War I. Many felt that it was something that we should not have got involved in, despite being part of the victor, being part of the Allies, the winning side of the war. But many Americans did not want the United States to get involved in another war like this, the war of this magnitude. What did this have to do with the Nye Commission? Well, the Nye Commission concluded that American bankers and defense manufacturers, manufacturers who made weapons, who made the boats and the tanks and the guns and the bullets and whatnot, caused the United States to enter World War I because they had the most to gain from the country entering World War I. Right? They were the ones that were going to be paid if the country happened to enter World War I because of the need for weapons. That's what the committee concluded. So when this report came out in 1934, it just added more support to those people who wanted to remain isolationist. And this kind of grew into a very strong debate between isolationists and interventionists. So what also fueled this debate between isolationists and interventionists is that Congress got involved and passed a series of neutrality acts between 1935, 6, 7, and there was another one, a fourth one, that was passed in 1939. And what these acts basically said is that they were designed to keep the United States neutral in any armed conflict that would take place in Europe. They basically said that no American citizen should sail on the ships of belligerent countries, belligerent referring to countries who are at war. They would outlaw weapons. You see Rambo here. They would outlaw the arms sales, so the United States could not sell weapons of war to countries who are at war with each other. And we would not loan any weapons of war or cash or anything like that to nations who are at war. The United States could not even help out even if a country was an innocent victim of an aggressive country at war. So we were very determined to stay out of any kind of armed conflict in Europe. All right, so those were the neutrality acts. We also practiced a policy of appeasement along with Europe. One of the key events that were taking place in the 1930s was the Spanish Civil War, where the fascist government that was headed by Francisco Franco overthrew the loyalist government. And Franco did that with the help of Adolf Hitler and the fascist party and the Nazis. And the United States largely chose to ignore it. We really did not get involved. In other words, we appeased Hitler in 1936. Appeasement simply means that you want to avoid conflict to maintain peace. And this is what largely happened and the way we approached the Spanish Civil War in 1936 through 1939. We basically let Hitler openly violate the Treaty of Versailles. To avoid war, he begins to rearm Germany, starts to occupy territory that he believes was wrongfully taken away from him at the end of World War I back in 1918. For example, the Rhineland, which is a small little territory that sits right here, if you can see it on the map, between France and Germany. He reoccupied that in 1936. He is building up the German military, which was in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles that Germany signed back in 1919. He annexed Austria. Here's Austria here. So he made Austria part of Germany. And he demands by 1937 and 38 a small little region of Czechoslovakia right here known as the Sudetenland because he believes it's rightfully German. There are 4 million German speakers that live there. And he is expanding Germany's borders, right? He called it Lebensraum, and it was basically to create Germany and create a bigger Germany, a broader Germany throughout Europe. So these are some of the things that he did, largely at the expense of the United States, Great Britain, and France, ignoring basically what he was doing. We basically let him do it because we basically felt France and Britain basically felt that what he was requesting really wasn't that unusual or that unreasonable. So leaders of Europe, including Hitler, met at Munich, Germany, known as the Munich Conference, and the leaders agreed to hand over the Sudetenland to Germany. And in return, Hitler promised not to take over any more territory. Hitler agrees then not to demand any more land, which of course was a lie. The Munich Conference has become this symbol throughout history as a failed policy of appeasement. Because what it did is eventually just basically showed him or taught him that France and Great Britain were not going to respond militarily to his demands, and it showed him that he was basically allowed to do whatever he wants. At this time, while this is going on in Europe, Japan is invading China. Remember I said a few moments ago that they first took over Manchuria. By 1937, they set their sights on China, and they started working their way south through China and into other lands and countries throughout Asia. And you can see here, by 1937, Franklin Roosevelt makes a famous speech. It was known as the Quarantine the Aggressor speech. He says, it seems to be unfortunately true that the epidemic of world lawlessness is spreading. So he's hinting at what Hitler's doing. He's hinting at what Italy has done. He's definitely talking about what Japan has done now in Asia. When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine. Sounds like what we've been through here in the world the last year with COVID. Of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. So he's comparing a physical ailment, a physical epidemic or pandemic, if you will, to what was going on with Hitler, Germany, Italy, Mussolini, and this disease of fascism he was referring to in Europe, how that's spreading already in the 1930s. And also he's referring to Japan and their aggressive nature throughout Asia. And he's comparing their actions to someone suffering from a disease or people going through a pandemic or an epidemic. So Japan is becoming even more hostile and aggressive. They threaten the open door policy in 1937, and they sink the U.S. gunboat, the Panay, in 1937, which really puts a strain on our relationship in Asia. 1939, World War II would begin. An unheard of event. It shocked the world. No one would ever thought that Hitler and Stalin would sign a non-aggression pact, but that's exactly what they did in August of 1939. And the reason being is that Hitler wanted to keep Stalin out of the war for as long as possible, and he believed that if he could get Stalin on his side, even though it was temporary, that would be a good thing for him. Both countries hated each other. Both men hated each other. This is a famous cartoon, seeing them as a married couple, which is symbolic of the non-aggression pact. And in this pact, both men agreed that Hitler would be allowed to attack Poland from the west. Stalin would be allowed to attack Poland from the east, and they would divide Poland up, and they wouldn't have to worry about a two-front war. And essentially what that means is that this allowed Hitler to set his sights on Western Europe for the time being. And like I said, Hitler and Stalin would secretly agree to divide Poland up between them. And once Germany invaded Poland, that officially began World War II in Europe, September 1st of 1939, which is a key date. World War II begins, and it would last in Europe until 1945. By June of 1940, it didn't take Hitler long to occupy and quickly conquer most of Europe. You see here on the map, Germany, here's Greater Germany. We see Italy down here. Once Hitler signed the non-aggression pact with Stalin, that basically kept Stalin, and here's the Soviet Union, kept Stalin at bay in the East, and Hitler did not have to worry about fighting the Soviets in what would become later the Eastern Front. Hitler would eventually break this pact in 1941, and he did invade the Soviet Union, but he didn't do that right away. So he put that off for a year and a half or 2 years, and by doing so, he was able to set his sights on the rest of Western Europe. So he sets his sights on Norway, on Sweden, on the Netherlands, eventually France, Belgium, and he was able to conquer the most of Western Europe over the next 9 to 12 months is about all it took him to do so. At this time, what is the U.S. doing? The U.S. is remaining neutral. Remember the neutrality acts that we had passed? We are staying out of this. We do not want the Axis powers to win, however. The Axis powers being made up of Germany and, of course, Italy, and eventually Japan would become part of the Axis powers as well. But on paper, we are a neutral country. However, much like World War I, it would be impossible for the United States to stay out of this war, and as months turned into years throughout the 1930s, the United States would slowly get involved. So, faced with the idea and the prospect that Hitler is going to take over all of Europe, Congress starts to slowly change these neutrality acts because, like you see in the picture here, Roosevelt is thinking the Allies need help. So the Neutrality Act of 1939 was amended to say that countries could buy weapons from the United States as long as they paid for them in cash and they sent their own ships over to the United States to pick them up. It was known as cash and carry. Okay, so this begs the question: are we really neutral? Again, we're neutral on paper, but now we're starting to help the Allies, namely Great Britain and France. Namely Great Britain, to help fight the Nazis there as early as 1939. Are we truly neutral? Some would argue no, of course we're not. By June of 1940, most of France is defeated and is occupied by Hitler and the Nazis. Here you see Hitler standing in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris in June of 1940. And by September of 1940, in the United States, the first peacetime conscription law is adopted, which is basically kind of a baby step toward a draft here in the United States. Now, this is a peacetime conscription law. We are not at war yet. Remember, we're still technically neutral. Germany at this time begins bombing England, known as the Battle of Britain, which is the famous air war, the air battle that began in August of 1940. So Britain now is under siege, and that puts even more immense pressure on the United States to help the British fight Hitler. U.S. involvement increases. There is a huge debate by 1939 and 40 whether or not the United States should get more involved in fighting Hitler in Great Britain and throughout Europe. There are organizations and committees that start to form. For one, the Committee to Defend America advocated helping England and helping allies because England and the United States share a common history. We talked about this during World War I. So there were organizations like the Committee to Defend America that were interventionists. On the other hand, you had committees like the America First Committee. They were very much opposed to U.S. involvement in World War II. One of the most famous people that were part of the America First Committee was Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot who flew across the Atlantic Ocean. By 1939 to 1940, the United States would sign a deal with England known as the Destroyers for Bases deal. In September 1940, the U.S. would give England U.S. warships, U.S. destroyers, and in exchange, Great Britain would allow us to use some of their islands as military bases in the Western Hemisphere. So again, this is another step closer for the United States becoming more and more involved. But remember, on paper, we are still neutral. By 1940, FDR is reelected. He's elected now for the third time. He breaks tradition. He is the first president to do so. He breaks tradition of President Washington and wins his unprecedented third term. Remember, all presidents basically have stepped down after 2 terms out of tradition. Roosevelt was elected a 3rd time, and then he would be elected a 4th time in 1944. So by 1940, here you see Roosevelt on the left, the British Prime Minister on the right, Winston Churchill. Churchill at this point is basically telling Roosevelt, we need help. And there have already been steps taken, right, between cash and carry. That was the first step. And then we had destroyers for bases. That was the second step. The next step was known as the Lend-Lease Act. Because FDR is becoming more worried as 1940 rolls on into early 1941, he's becoming very worried about the access of winning and taking over all of Europe, because really Great Britain is the only allied country left standing that is in the war. So he has Congress signs what's known as the Lend-Lease Bill, and this brings the United States even closer to war. This eliminated the cash and carry requirement. Remember, that requirement was countries, they could buy weapons from the U.S., but they had to pay cash and they had to send their own ships to get them. The Lend-Lease Bill eliminated that. Now the U.S. would send supplies on U.S. ships to countries that were victim of Nazi aggression, Axis aggression. And with this act, President Roosevelt gave his famous Arsenal of Democracy speech, telling the world that the United States would need to be the great arsenal of democracy, and that the United States could not avoid fighting in this war. Technically, we are still neutral because the Congress has not declared war yet, but that day is coming by the end of 1941. There is absolutely no question that the United States was not truly neutral. The Lend-Lease Act, probably you can look at, if anything, it was an economic declaration of war, but an official military declaration of war is still to come. By this time, in 1941, remember I said a few moments ago that Hitler would eventually violate the non-aggression pact against Stalin. He would do so in the summer of 1941, the fall of 41, with Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was the code name, the military code name, given to the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. So now Hitler, after he occupied and took over much of Western Europe, turns his sights on Eastern Europe, namely the Soviet Union. The United States is actually drawing closer to war through a convoy system. We had to make sure that these weapons and whatnot that we were lending and leasing to Great Britain and the Allies would get there. And with that, we developed a convoy system. So the United States begins escorting these supplies across the Atlantic Ocean, being escorted by U.S. warships. In the summer of 1941, you see Roosevelt met Churchill in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean near Iceland, and he signed the Atlantic Charter. And they met secretly there off the coast of Newfoundland and Iceland. And there what they did is they outlined their goals as to what the world they hoped would look like once the war was over. They talked about how countries should be, it should be left up to themselves to self-determine what their government should be like. Free trade among countries. Countries should not be seeking territorial gains. That there should be a new collective security organization that would become the United Nations. So these are just a few of the things that they talked about and signed off on. Here you see a copy of the Atlantic Charter in 1941. However, the United States entry into World War II, remember, does not come until the end of 1941. And it would be a result of what is not taking place in Europe with Hitler, but is taking place in Asia. And of course, specifically, I'm referring to the bombing of Pearl Harbor by Japan. So let's take a look at our relationship with Japan. Here you see Japan and what they had occupied as the years went by. Here was Japan in 1870, and you can see how it steadily grew and started to take over parts of Asia, namely China, eventually what would become Vietnam. We have Thailand, Burma, all the way down as far south as the Philippines, and eventually just north of Australia. So by 1939, you're looking here kind of at the Japanese Empire. And the United States was alone in trying to check the Japanese expansion into Asia. So what Roosevelt does is he orders an embargo against Japan to try and slow them down. They would not deal with China. They would not send Japan any more steel, any more iron, any more oil. And that would basically be the equivalent of a declaration of war on Japan. Japan would occupy French Indochina in July of 1941. That is what we know as Vietnam today. And Roosevelt would order all Japanese assets here in the United States, financial assets, all assets, frozen. And he would also then put a permanent ban on all oil sales with the country of Japan. Negotiations would be ongoing between the two countries. But as these negotiations are ongoing, the Japanese government is designing and devising and carrying out the bombing attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So that's when the United States enters the war. What you're looking at here is a rendition of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th of 1941. So the U.S. years of World War II, then of course, are 1941 to 1945. And what you want to pay attention to here, especially in the notes, and what the APUSH exam focuses on, isn't so much the events that led up to the war, what we just covered. Yes, you do need to know the causes, but really what you want to know is once the United States got involved, you want to know that content very well. Okay, so you want to be able to explain how and why the U.S. participated in the war and how that transformed American society. What you're looking at here is a really good LEQ type question. All right, and what you're looking here on the right are some good historical developments. How the United States mobilized for war, how that helped us end the Great Depression, how we created this strong industrial base that helped us win the war. How mobilization provided opportunities for women and minorities to improve their socioeconomic status. How this war generated challenges to civil liberties here, such as internment, for example, the Japanese-American internment camps that were created, and migration to the United States from Mexico and elsewhere to the Western Hemisphere, how that took place, why that took place. So these are all the things that you want to be aware of as you're preparing for the exam on chapters 23 and 24. So the United States enters the war then after after Pearl Harbor is bombed in December of 41. Congress declares war on Japan, and that basically put an end to any isolationist movement. The United States entered the war in December of 41, and really the United States had already been mobilizing for war long before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We had the Selective Service Act. We had factories that were producing Lend-Lease supplies. Remember all those supplies and weapons of war that we were shipping over to Great Britain? We were already on the path to become officially involved in the war and helping the Allies. Now, who were the Allies? The Allies were officially England, the Soviet Union, because once Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin became an ally of ours. The United States, France, and China were the 5 official allies, big allies, in World War II. And remember, the Axis powers consisted of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The role of the federal government expanded, and it became much greater, much larger, broader than it had during the New Deal or during World War I. That was one of the major changes in government during World War II. World War II also brought about a huge mobilization on the home front. Factories that produced goods and services during peacetime, for example, automobiles and whatnot, were now producing wartime goods. For example, ammunition and bullets and guns and tanks. And this brought on a huge mobilization here at the home front here in the United States. And this is what brought an end to the Great Depression. Remember, we talked about how the New Deal helped some people, didn't help others, and it slowly kept the United States economy afloat, but it did not end the Great Depression. It was World War II and the mobilization for World War II that ended the Great Depression here in the United States. So what did this mobilization look like? This is one of the key things that you want to know for the test and for the AP exam. The United States Congress created the War Production Board, and what that did is it allocated resources to the war effort. This would be one of the ways how factories were told what to produce and how much to produce and how much to allocate. The Office of Price Administration was created. Prices were frozen. Wages were frozen for a couple of years. Goods were rationed. For example, meat and gas and sugar. There were many goods and services that were rationed to consumers like you and me during World War II. Everybody played a role and everybody played a part during World War II. America's industrial output was a huge factor in the way that we conducted the war and would be a key element in how we eventually would win the war. The Office of Research and Development contracted scientists, universities, colleges, research universities to help tech development. For example, this was the war that saw radar invented. It saw sonar invented, rockets. All the different kinds of technology that was invented for wartime took place during World War II, and here in the United States, it was through the Office of Research and Development. Specifically, I mentioned earlier that this was the war that brought on the dropping of 2 atomic bombs at the end of the war in 1945. That whole project was known as the Manhattan Project, and it was the top secret program that was headed by scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer. And it took about 3 or 4 years, the better part of those 4 years, to develop the atomic bomb that eventually would be dropped on Japan to end the war in Asia in August of 1945. Okay, so what was the social impact of World War II? Well, let's talk about African Americans first. The social impact and the impact it had on African Americans is that it led to another great migration. Recall that the first one took place in the 1920s, right after World War I. Well, by 1939, 40, 41, this led to a second great migration. Over 1 million African Americans left the South in search of jobs in war-specific industries in the North. Discrimination and prejudice was very common in defense work, and in 1943, race riots would break out again, specifically in Detroit and New York. So we see this pattern develop again. We saw it for the first time in the 1920s during the Great Migration. Fast forward about 15, 20 years, and it took place again. A. Philip Randolph, which was kind of like a Martin Luther King figure, he threatened to march on Washington if discrimination in defense work was not addressed by President Roosevelt. He was a civil rights activist in the 1940s. FDR did not get any civil rights legislation passed, but he did issue Executive Order 8802, and what that did is that it served eventually, it called for fair employment practices in the defense industries. So even though there wasn't actual civil rights legislation passed, the executive order did state that fair employment practices must take place. The military is still segregated, so African Americans served in a segregated army, but they served very proudly. They fought for democracy abroad, and they were also fighting for democracy at home. Many African Americans who served in the military, in fact, you can argue all of them, believe that by fighting Nazism and what Nazism stood for, trying to defeat Nazism abroad, they were hoping that the United States, of course, would become free at home as well. So they were fighting against fascism abroad. They were fighting against racism at home. But when many got home, they were disappointed, yet to find, of course, a segregated United States. We do see membership in the NAACP begin to increase during this time. This is the national, if you recall, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded by W.E.B. Du Bois. We talked about the NAACP earlier. And CORE, one of the early first civil rights organizations, the Congress of Racial Equality, is formed in 1942 to fight and combat this discrimination that African Americans are largely experiencing throughout the United States. How are Mexican Americans and Native Americans affected? Well, the demand for workers in the defense industries and wartime industries provide job opportunities for Mexican Americans as well. And what you need to remember in terms of World War II and APUSH is that many joined the government program known as the Bracero program, created in 1942. And this allowed Mexican farm workers to work in the United States without formal immigration proceedings. And what they did is they worked largely in the Southwest. Many worked on produce and agricultural farms out in California, New Mexico, and that was largely their contribution to the war effort. Racial tensions between white soldiers and Mexican residents hit an all-time high in LA. In 1943, they were known as the Zoot Suit Riots, and many Native Americans received opportunities in defense work as well, and many served in the military, the most famous of which were the Navajo Code Talkers, who served in largely the Navy, and they helped break the Japanese code, and they also put the United States code into Navajo, which would confuse the Japanese, of course, because they were unable to break U.S. code because it was largely in the language of the Navajo. Okay, so the Navajo Code Talkers used their own native language to communicate in the Pacific theater of war, which led, of course, to Allied victories throughout the Pacific theater of war. How did the United States change socially and demographically? Well, over 200,000 women served in the military in non-combat roles. One of the key minority groups you definitely want to know and remember that were affected by the war was women. And as a result, because of the demand for industrial and defense jobs, not only did African Americans and other minorities seek these jobs, but women employment increased nearly by 5 million that entered the workforce during World War II. And the symbol of this was the propaganda poster. She was known as Rosie the Riveter. This is an extremely famous poster, which became the symbol of opportunity for all women during World War II. And women, however, continued to receive lower pay than men. And once the war was over, they were expected to leave as these soldiers and veterans started to come home back to the United States. But there were huge demographic changes that took place as many people started to head to the Midwest. You can see many move from south to the Midwest, from south to north, and there were plenty that started to move out to the Seattle area and out to Los Angeles and San Francisco, looking for work in these war industries, and looking for defense work. The post-war migration out west started to create what would later become known as the Sun Belt. States known as New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California, Utah, and Nevada. Now, we talked a little bit how World War II affected civil liberties of certain groups of people, and none was more important than Japanese Americans. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, FDR issued Executive Order 9006, which required that all people of Japanese descent on the West Coast be relocated to internment camps. And this term, the Nisei, refers to the second generation Japanese Americans, and they were largely affected. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans, these were citizens just like you and me, they were relocated to one of 10 different internment camps that you see here on the map. A couple were in Arkansas, but for the most part, the other 8 or so were out west. Okay, and there was a large Japanese population in Hawaii, but they were not evacuated at the time. Why were they placed in internment camps? Because the U.S. government believed that because there was such a large Japanese population out west, there was a fear that the Japanese would attack the mainland United States. By 1944, the lawsuit that came out of this event, out of the Executive Order 9006, known as Korematsu versus the United States, was heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the relocation, claiming that it was necessary in the name of national security. Thousands of Japanese fought bravely on behalf of the United States that were part of the U.S. military. And President Truman even said so in the speech that he gave as he welcomed many of these ROTC soldiers home at the end of the war. But in 1944, the Supreme Court said that what FDR did, the relocation, was constitutional. All right, now, getting here to the end, make sure again that you can explain the causes and the effects of the victory of the United States. We're talking now the last few minutes here of the effects of the victory of the United States in World War II and how Americans viewed the war as a survival of freedom and democracy. How military service provided opportunities for women and minorities, how that would lead into future opportunities into the 1950s. And we're also taking a look here what starts to develop the United States and its allies achieve military victory through cooperation, technological, scientific advancements, the use of atomic bombs, and the beginning of the nuclear age. So one of the effects of World War II are the things that actually start to take place in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. So fighting World War II, the Allies focused first on the European theater of war, taking out Germany and Italy. All right. And once the United States became involved, we actually become involved in Northern Africa first, and we start making our way up the boot that is Italy, and our focus becomes larger Europe, not necessarily Asia. Okay. Soviets stopped the German advance at Stalingrad. This would be a turning point battle on the Eastern Front. This would actually ultimately lead to the demise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. The Allies focused first, like I mentioned, on North Africa and then into Italy. Now, what you want to remember here is at the same time this is going on, we also open up the theater of war in the Pacific and trying to fight the Japanese in the Pacific as well. By 1944, we do open up a second front here in Europe, namely France and what known as become D-Day, which was a massive land invasion of the Allies onto France, hoping to liberate France from Nazi control and push the Germans back toward Berlin from the west. And that's exactly what happened. The Red Army, the Soviets are pushing Hitler and the fascists, the Nazis, back to Berlin from the east once they win in Stalingrad. So the Germany is being squeezed from both directions here, and actually from the south as well, coming up through Italy. So the big three would meet. The big three, I'm referring to FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. Here you see FDR and Churchill. They would meet at Casablanca in northern Africa in 1943 to discuss what the world is going to look like, what is Europe going to look like. The main topics at Casablanca were they want Hitler and the Axis powers to unconditionally surrender, completely give up everything, and they talk about this invasion here, the invasion of Italy and Sicily. That's what comes out of the Casablanca conference. Here you see the big three at Tehran in Iran in 1943 in November. There they meet to talk about D-Day. They would talk about this opening up of this Western Front right here. What is that going to look like? And what is going to happen to Eastern Europe once the war is over? So those are the main topics. Those are the talking points at the Tehran conference. And one of the last big conferences was in 1945. Here you see the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, meeting at Yalta, which was Stalin's resort in southern Russia. There they talk about what Germany specifically is going to look like. It's going to be divided up into sectors. They want Eastern Europe to have free elections. They want the Soviets to help out defeating Japan in the Pacific. And really, for the first time, they start talking about this new thing called the United Nations and what this peacekeeping organization is going to look like. Okay, so we are going to need help in defeating Japan because right now the atomic bomb has not been tested yet, and no one knew if it was going to be successful. This was in February of 45. The bomb would not be tested till July of 45. So that's why, if you're wondering why we went to Stalin and asked for help, this is why we did so. We didn't know if the bomb would be successful or not. While all of that is going on in the European theater of war, we have the Pacific theater of war. And what you're looking at here is the Japanese Empire. Everything that's inside this red line is essentially what the Japanese controlled. And it was largely the U.S. military that was responsible to fight the Japanese in the Pacific theater of war between 1941 and 45. So following Pearl Harbor, Japan occupied there everything that you see within this line. It was a huge amount of territory. And the United States employed a strategy known as island hopping, where they would strategically kind of hop like a frog does from lily pad to lily pad. We would hop from island to island to island to island, hoping to liberate those islands, take them back over, kick off the Japanese, and eventually make our way closer to the Japanese mainland that you see up here. So by 1945, once Yalta takes place, FDR dies. Now the new president, President Truman, who has taken over, he and Churchill and Stalin meet at Potsdam. And here is where the bomb is successfully tested. Truman informs the other leaders of the big three that the United States has a new weapon that they're going to use on Japan if necessary. And the United States warns Japan that they need to unconditionally surrender or be destroyed. They did not unconditionally surrender. The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945. Here you see on the map where Hiroshima was. Here you see the mushroom cloud that ensued because of that bomb. And then the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Here you see here in southern Japan, and the mushroom cloud that came out of that. That was on August 9th of 1945. And those two bombs officially put an end to World War II. And following World War II, the United States would be the dominant political, the dominant economic, and the dominant military country in the world. We would be the only country to possess nuclear weapons. It would be another 4 years before the Russians would devise their first atomic bomb. So, as a review, here's our checklist again. There you see one of the famous British World War II propaganda posters. It's one of my favorites. The British holding the line against the Nazis in the Battle of Britain, and Churchill being symbolized there as a bulldog. But here you see the checklist, and making sure that you go back and do a quick review of these things, making sure that you're reading, of course, Chapter 24, using this along with your reading and your reading guide. So with that, thanks, guys, for listening, and we will see you soon. Bye for now.